All along the way, Jesus has been warning the disciples that he is going to suffer. But why? What is the purpose of this suffering? We begin to understand the purpose of Jesus' suffering as Jesus prepares to share the Passover meal with his disciples. John Daniels now is going to give us a little bit of background and insight into the ritual and Jewish holiday of Passover.
The idea of the week is liberation and Passover. The Jews of Jesus' day had had their consciousness shaped by great festivals that marked the important transforming moments in their history as a people. One of these transforming moments is when they were delivered out of bondage in Egypt under the leadership of Moses. As the story goes, the last of 10 plagues that were delivered on Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go, God sent an angel of death throughout Egypt to every home and barnyard, and that angel of death would take the firstborn. The Hebrews were instructed to sacrifice a lamb and take the blood of that lamb and smear it on their doorposts. And when the death angel came a-knocking, it would pass over their homes and spare the firstborn child in that household. Now, when Jesus gathered his disciples in that last night before he was crucified, whether by strategy or coincidence, it happened during the time of Passover. And as he had them at the table, he referred to the elements that he shared with them at supper as referring to this moment of great liberation. This moment with Jesus and his disciples at the table, sharing the bread and the wine, marks that transforming moment in the earliest Christian origins. We are free because of Jesus' life and sacrifice.
Let's take a look at the Passover meal as is traditionally celebrated by the Jewish people, by the ancient Israelites. Each one of the foods that appear in the Passover meal have an extreme significance related to the liberation of the Israelites from the land of Egypt. For example, there are always two bitter herbs used in every Passover Seder meal. One is usually horseradish. The other is usually something like a romaine lettuce. And these bitter herbs symbolize the bitterness of slavery and the slavery experience. There's also another bitter herb usually that is accompanied in the meal, and that is signified here by the parsley. The parsley is served with a bowl of salt water, the salt water signifying the bitter tears of slavery. And the parsley would then be eaten by dipping the parsley into the salt water, and then it's consumed like that. We'd also find in the Passover meal a roasted egg. The egg signifies one of the sacrifices that is made during the festival, made in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the egg would be placed in the oven and roasted until it got dark, and then it would be eaten as a part of the meal. Now, there are two things that I don't have here on the table with me. One is a kind of fruit and nut mixture that's blended until it becomes a kind of a paste. And that paste resembles the mortar that was used between the bricks that were used to build the palaces and the pyramids and the storehouses in Egypt. Those very buildings that the Israelite slaves built. And so they're reminded of the hard work that they were forced to do in Egypt. Also, we would have a roasted lamb bone representing the lamb that was sacrificed on the original night of Passover. It was that lamb that was eaten before the next morning when the people left Egypt. And it was the blood from that lamb that was sprinkled on the doorpost so that the angel of death would pass over the houses of the Israelites as it went about doing its work. We'd also find matzah, or unleavened bread, a kind of flat bread like this, would also be included in the Passover meal. And the unleavened bread signifies, of course, the fact that when the Israelites left Egypt, they left quickly. They did not have time to take many of their belongings. They did not have time to let the bread rise, to finish rising. They had to take what they had and go quickly as they could to escape the land of Egypt. And so unleavened bread is used. And finally, wine was served, and every participant in the meal would drink 4 glasses of wine. These 4 glasses of wine represent the 4 promises that God makes to the Israelites. In Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, God says in those verses, I will deliver, I will take, I will redeem, and I will bring out. those 4 wonderful promises of God that are realized, of course, when the Israelites escape Egypt and end up traveling through the wilderness to the promised land.
So Jesus Christ gathered at the table with his disciples, with his friends, and they were celebrating the Seder meal. And now we gather today as a community of people. We gather once a month in the Methodist Church around the bread and the cup, and we celebrate a meal. And we remember Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection. And for me, every time I come to that table, I can think about what's going on in my own life. Where am I feeling oppressed? Where am I feeling trapped? What in life is preventing me from living life to the fullest, where I think God really wants me to experience joy and peace in the greatest capacity? And it's there that we need to remember that Christ, through his suffering, death, and resurrection, has set us free from everything in the world that can oppress us, that we've been given freedom from slavery to sin and slavery from death. And we can have complete joy and freedom in Jesus Christ.
The meal that Jesus shares with his disciples in that upper room is a reinterpretation of the Passover meal. It helps us to understand what is about to happen to Jesus. You see, first Jesus takes the bread and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he gives it to his disciples. This is a direct allusion to 2 stories earlier in Mark, where Jesus takes bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it, first to 5,000 people and then to 4,000 people. Jesus is saying that this bread is like his body, which he is about to give, the life that he is about to give for others. And then Jesus picks up the cup, and again he lifts it up and he blesses it and he gives it. This is a direct allusion to the covenant of Moses, which is ratified by the shedding of blood. You see, the Passover, the meaning of the Passover and the Passover meal has to do with the liberation of God's people from Egypt. And Jesus' death or Jesus' suffering is also an act of liberation, because through Jesus' death and through his suffering, God's people are again about to be free. They're about to be liberated. This time not from a Pharaoh, but from sin and from guilt and from shame itself. This is the meaning of Jesus' suffering.
John Wesley here. It is the duty of every Christian to receive the Lord's Supper as often as he can. The first reason why it is the duty of every Christian so to do is because it is a plain command of Christ. He said, "Do this in remembrance of me." A second reason why every Christian should do this as often as he can is because the benefits of doing so are so great, including the forgiveness of our past sins and the present strengthening and refreshing of our souls.
But my church only serves communion once a month.
You lazy Americans, let everyone who has any desire to please God obey God and consult the good of his own soul by celebrating every time he can, like the first Christians, with whom communion was a constant part of the Lord's day service. And for several centuries they received it almost every day. Oh well, you're only hurting yourself, for communion is the food of our souls. It gives strength to perform our duty and leads us onto perfection.
All of this is really pretty exciting news for the disciple of Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus' suffering has set us free. It frees us from the Pharaohs and all the Pharaoh's petty oppressions. It frees us from our past. It frees us from our sin. It frees us from guilt and from fear. It frees us from the fear of the future so that we are free to venture out into the great unknown, free to follow Jesus wherever he leads. See you on the way.